Welcome to Never Too Early, a YouTube series focused on unconventional talent insights for founders. I'm Lauren Ipsen, talent partner at Decibel, and this is our founder therapy series. We'll be spending time with executives that have taken the leap recently to start their own venture-backed tech companies. We'll cover early learnings, misconceptions, mistakes, and a whole lot more. Today, I'm super excited to welcome my guest, Matt Peters. Matt was the chief product officer at Expel before embarking on his entrepreneurial journey a year and a half ago. All right, Matt Peters, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Super jazzed to be here.
Thank you for being here with me. How are you doing today?
Doing really well. Doing really well. Always a ton to do, but we're coming into the new year strong, so I feel pretty good.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for joining me. I super appreciate it. Matt is someone that is in the Decibel portfolio that I have had the great pleasure of spending a lot of time with. And I personally feel that there's so much that we've worked through together that can be really helpful for a lot of our listeners. So I want to start from the beginning and ask you if you always had the founder itch or if that was something that came about more recently in life.
So I would say I haven't always had the founder itch. One of the things that happened though pretty early on in my career is I started getting like more and more visibility into other parts of the business. So like when I was at Mandiant, I got connected with some folks and I got to watch sort of the Mandiant story, and we got acquired by FireEye, and I got to watch sort of that transition, and then joined as employee number one at Expel. One of the things there was the founders there were very, very intentional. I got to really learn a lot because they understood something that I think a lot of people might miss. I know that I would have screamed right past it, which is like, you're a founder. You're not just building a product, right? You're not just building a team. You're building a product and a team and a company all at the same time. Like there's just a whole bunch of degrees of freedom in that problem. Once I really saw that, I was like, wow, I'm really interested. I was sort of blessed by working with some people that I really respect and like. And so several of us then said, hey, we've learned a tremendous amount, working together. We'd like to go try doing this ourselves and sort of see, try our hand at it. So that's how I got into, being a founder.
Talk to me about some of the different roles that you took on or areas that you leaned into that set you up really, really well for being a CEO.
I came out of college and I went to work at a company that was doing sort of, think about it as sort of like telephone switch networking optimization, right? So like a lot of the software I wrote is the kind of software you would never actually interact with. It's more like embedded systems, stuff like this. I then ended up at a company where I worked, and I was one of the early engineers. So I built the product, but then as we were going out to market, because I had built a lot of software, I ended up being sort of one of the points of contact. So I worked a lot with the early companies that deployed the thing, and so I got to go on site with them. I got to work with the SEs, that sort of thing, and that kind of gave me a perspective on like, okay, so there's a relationship between sort of features that you build and how hard the thing is to configure and whether or not you're selling to enterprise or you're selling to mid-market, because we had different size of customers and the product was really easy for some customers, really hard for others. And like, I got to really understand that. And then at that same company, I got to work, as I was working on the architecture, I got to work with the marketing team a lot on sort of like, how are we talking about this? How are we positioning it? Like, where was it going? So I got to sort of see some of that play out, is like, how did we take this set of features that like I understood in one way, like I understood them like an engineer, and then the way that you talk about them externally, the way you talk about them to the market, is you actually talk about them from the customer's perspective, and that was kind of mind blowing. I'm going to be honest with you, like when I saw that parallax, we're talking about the same thing but we're using totally different words, it was really, really interesting. And so that was like another kind of big aha, wow, so there's this whole marketing thing that has to go well in order for this product to do what it needs to do. And then when we launched the product, in that case, the product was not initially that successful. We were really struggling, like the sales weren't picking up. And I took a look, and we went out and we asked some of the sales engineers we were working with, and they were like, hey, the salespeople don't know how to sell this thing. They've been selling something else for years. They have no idea how to sell this thing. And so we're like, oh, okay, well, like, let's do a whole bunch of enablement. And so we focused on a lot of that. Sales went up, and I was like, oh, okay, so there's a whole bunch more stuff we have to do. When I ended up at Mandiant, that was my first exposure into sort of the services and product world. So Mandiant was primarily a services organization. We had products as well, and it was my first time really getting to see what that combination could do, right? And so it was a fascinating thing, and that then led to this sort of like, aha, where I was like, the problems I'm really fascinated by are sort of these intricate, like, people and technology and how they kind of come together, which is then what took me. I met the folks who founded Expel, and that's what took me to Expel, was building that
Yeah.
out and getting that chance there. So
Cool. Okay. Talk to me about what you're working on, what you're building, and what ultimately got you to a place where you decided that this was the area that you wanted to take a bet on as a founder.
the thing that I got really interested in while I was at Expel was this notion of how do you end up making people effective in using technology, right? So we were solving at that point a security problem, right? We were actually we were doing a managed security thing. We were helping monitor people's networks for attackers, and then we would swoop in and help save them. And at the time, everybody was struggling to do that well, to do it with high quality, but at scale, because there was sort of a natural tension in that. It's hard to do something at scale and do it really, really well. And what we discovered was actually, if you solve a different problem, if you don't solve a security problem, if you don't show up with threat intel or an endpoint solution or any of that sort of stuff, but you instead show up and say, what I need to do is I need to make a person very effective at making a decision quickly, because the decision is this alert an attacker or not? And if you could make that decision in about 30 seconds or less, the rest of that problem is kind of gravy. And so when we had that aha, we were like, oh, wow, we're talking about decision support. This is a whole class. People study this. It's an understood thing. So we started working on how do you make a software platform that makes people really, really effective. And I kind of fell in love with that class of problem. That's the thing that really gets me up in the morning, is how do you make people, be it your customers or your own service folks, how do you make them effective using technology? So fast forward, we've been there for a number of years, and my co-founders and I are all sitting around. We're like, well, we'd love to try this on our own. And so we're starting to look around for a problem space where that exists, where there's a tension in the market between scale and quality, something like this. And then the second piece is we're really interested in, hey, if we could bring to bear this idea of if you can optimize for the human moment, that's really the thing that we're interested in. And so one of my co-founders stumbled on this report by this company called Happy Signals. And in that report, they did a survey of a whole bunch of end users about IT help desk, which is sort of adjacent to security monitoring. So it was one of the spaces that we had been exposed to. And the report said two things that got my attention. The first one was 50% of people avoid going to their help desk. Right. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. If you have a problem and you're under no circumstances am I going to the people who are going to help me? I refuse. Right. That's super interesting. And then the second thing,
honestly.
Yeah, well, yeah, no. And so anybody who's been never mind, my mouse just doesn't work anymore. We're done. I'm moving on. Right. And so
I'll figure it out.
Exactly. So the second thing was in this, and this was the part that really got me excited, was of the people who did go to their help desk and had a good experience, the majority of them said the reason they had a good experience was not because of how fast their problem was fixed, or even that their problem was fixed. It was the attitude of the person that helped them. Right. And the thing that got me excited about that is I think oftentimes in Silicon Valley, and I'm guilty of this too, I'm a technologist, we think tech first. We think robots, let's automate it, let's go, that kind of thing. Right. But what this was saying was actually the problem is a texture problem. Right. The problem is I want to feel a certain way when I interact with the help desk. I want the attitude of the person, right, to be a certain way. And so we said to ourselves, oh, that's fascinating. Can you scale that? Can you scale care? And that was so weird sounding, because we're scaling care, that. Those two words don't even, that doesn't even grammatically. I mean, what? And it's that kind of challenge I think is fascinating, where you take something and you're okay, yeah. And so at exactly that moment, large language models had kind of burst on the scene. And so we were we're seeing a technology that for the first time might be able to help do a thing like this. And the thing that got me really excited about that was that allowed us to kind of we could use technology to keep people at the center, which is the thing that I think, again, optimizing people, optimizing that human moment. That was the thing that we did. And so it seemed like we had a problem statement, and we had a desire to solve that problem. And so we started talking to some people, just sort of by the by. And I will tell you, so advice for founders, if you are talking to somebody about the problem you're trying to solve and they lean into the camera and they say, I've been thinking about this for years, you might be onto something, right? And that's what happened to us, was we just kept having that happen. And we're okay, we might be onto something, right? And so that's sort of how we decided that it was time to go.
I love that. That's awesome. I personally am completely guilty of, I think I partially just assume that if things aren't working, that it's on me.
Because you're a bad person and you should stop that, right?
100%. It's me.
And then there's that moment where if you do go and get help and the person's oh man, that must be super frustrating. And you feel so seen in that moment.
I'm
And
like, oh, I'm like, oh, thank
you know,
you.
so yeah, that's really all we want. Can you take all of this amazing technology, all of this ineffable large language model stuff, and can you channel it in that way so that somebody goes to work and feels seen? And then Forrester did some research on this and basically said, look, like what makes people happy at work is that they feel like they can make progress on important goals, right? And so that they can make progress thing, one of the number one things is the equipment I have works. Right. So we figured like, hey, we're working on an important thing. So it all kind of lined up and we were pretty jazzed about it.
I love it so much. Something I've found personally with a lot of my first time founders is that, they have to pivot the product a couple times over before they ultimately find PMF. And so I'm curious if that's something that Fixify has gone through, if there's been lots of iterations of the product, or if what you see today is exactly as the initial plan was written up.
I would start with one thing that we went in eyes wide open on is that we didn't know a bunch of stuff. So actually the way that we sort of positioned our initial plan was here's a bunch of stuff we don't know. And so our first step is to go find them out, right? And we actually use a phrase internally. We're like what we're actually building is a learning engine, right? Like that is the company we're building. Is like over time, there's a whole bunch of stuff we're going to discover, and the success or failure of this organism is going to be whether or not we can effectively learn. So that's sort of like foundational. So like secondarily, have we pivoted? Well, when I think about a pivot, I tend to think about like immediate sort of total change in direction based on some like feedback. We haven't done that as much, but what we have is we've discovered that so many of the things that we initially thought were wrong, that it's kind of comical. So to start with, like a good example would be we went out with this problem statement, hey, we're going to be building this sort of help desk solution and platform for companies, and we originally had sort of identified a target market, sort of this size, this class of user, this class of company, sort of this geography, that kind of thing. And what we did was we were like, look, that's our thesis. And we're going to go talk to 10 customers and sort of validate this thesis. And folks were nice enough to connect us with lots of people. We had a bunch of conversations. And at the end of it, we're like, we have a problem because like we're not hearing the same ping back that we heard when we initially talked to people about the idea. Right. Mm-hmm. And so what that told us was like, the problem exists out there. Like we know it does. We also happen to know it because there's just a whole bunch of like ancillary services that have gone up around this. But in that market, we weren't getting the ping back. So we had to have a sort of a meeting. We did some data analysis. We came back and said, okay, it's probably not this market. Let's see if we can go up and try to go up in size, right? I got to be honest. I was sort of dead set against that. I was like, no, we just keep going. But like as a team, we also agreed, let's go try it. And so we went and talked to another group of customers. And when we moved up in size, we started getting the ping back. And we're like, oh, okay. So like we just miscalculated the size pretty fundamentally here. So that was one of our first pivots. That was like earliest days. That was one of the things that we changed.
So immediately kind of working through changing the ICP a little bit before going back to changing the product.
Yeah. And one of the things that we did as well. So we were talking to customers. I mean, we founded the company in September. We didn't have a product until like, Q2 of the following year, but we were talking to customers like in September, right? So like the early days, so we had time to sort of like iterate through this thing. So it wasn't as emergent as it could have been. We didn't wait till we had the product to start, talking to customers and selling it.
So smart.
One of the things I heard someone say, and I think it was a really useful thing, is like your go-to-market will always be behind. Like 100%, like you will always be behind where you want to be, and so start it earlier, or just start earlier, right? So we started talking to customers and sort of seeing, validating the thing, day one. And so the ICP iteration. The other thing that we did was we constantly tested our understanding of the ICP. So like we went out and we found like, hey, these are customers who said that they would be, trial customers. Okay, awesome. Let's do some biographies, that sort of stuff. We've then gotten more diligent as we got real marketing people in. We actually went and did like structured buyer persona interviews. So if people are the marketing people that I trust tend to use a framework around buyer personas done by like Adele Ravello, and this sort of like interview structure that you do. And like what you come away with is like a real in-depth understanding of like the problem that you're solving for who, and when do they have that problem and when to sell. So like we've iterated constantly on that. On the product side, we've also had a bunch of like changes, learnings, things like this. So like a good example of this is like, originally we knew that we were going to connect up, like our product connects up to your help desk environment. We pull in a bunch of tickets and we do a whole bunch of metrics and stuff. And this is purely and selfishly, initially, it was just for us so we could know how bad is this going to be. You know what I mean? Like that was all
Yeah.
it was. But what we discovered when we started demoing to people in the early days, they were like, oh, these metrics are amazing. Can I have these? And we're like,
Hmm.
the onboarding screen? And they're like, yeah, just that. And we're like, yeah, exactly. No, 100%, because that's actually what we meant, right? And so, like, I remember one of the conversations where we realized that, like, you actually can hear in the conversation the doubt and shock in our voices. And we're like,
Hmm.
me in the onboarding screen? But we sat back, we listened, we asked the customer, like, why is it useful? What's it doing? This kind of thing. And then we realized, oh man, this is actually a whole feature set, a whole problem, a sub problem in this space that we just totally blew past. We had no idea it existed. So we got to go back and say, like, okay, one, it's in our path. We have to solve it before we get to our follow-on product problem. And then how do we think about solving that? So that was like an aha. And so that sort of helped to drive it. And then there were a lot of things around sort of how like the onboarding of the product worked, how like we got people, in and that sort of thing that we've had to revisit, like as we've gotten more people in. So one of the things that we did there was we're like, this is very much the part where we're going to build the airplane while we're flying it. So
Mhm.
you've got to have a lot of people with a lot of time to look at this over and over again and be like, okay, what happened? All right, fix it. What happened? And now fix it. That kind of thing. So there have been a lot of sort of mini pivots in the onboarding portion of the thing as well. So those are a
Totally.
couple of the examples, but like in all of them, the thing that I think helped us was we had a tremendous amount of sort of just a high trust, like between the founders and the team,
Hmm.
where somebody could show up and be like, that thing you worked on did not work, right? Or
Yeah.
that idea you had was wrong. And like nobody was going to be like, but that was my idea. Like
Yeah.
we were wrong about the ICP. And like as much as I was like intellectually invested in like, well, this is my pontification about what size of customer we're at, that's not
Yeah.
going to sell anything. So like
You
we got to
just kind of have to take your ego out of it
yeah,
and say like, this is what it is and this is what's getting the right responses, and
exactly.
that's
Yeah.
okay that it's different than what we initially anticipated. I
Yep.
think it can be really challenging for very, very deeply technical CEOs to, really think about the fact that the product doesn't have to be perfect, and the customer can dictate more so than your dream what the product ultimately looks like. Um, and I think that's something that I am constantly working through with a lot of our founders is, okay, what you've built is incredible, but is this actually where the gap in the market is? Is this actually what people are going to want to buy?
Yeah.
Or is it just something that's really, really cool and useful and a nice to have, but not like really where the gap is, right?
Yeah.
So the go to market side of things can really dictate how to come back and build the best product for the customer. Um, and it can be very, very different than what you initially anticipate it being, which is why I wanted to kind of touch on some of this with you, because I think early adopters, early design partners, and just open communication amongst the team, and really kind of being self-aware and looking at what you've built and saying like, this is working, this isn't, is the best way to get out of the gates really quickly. Okay, let's talk a little bit about pipeline, specifically on the go-to-market side of things. So how has that process been for you as someone that's more of a deeply technical founder? What have the biggest learnings been and challenges that you faced in closing your first couple big deals?
My background's in cybersecurity. It's not in IT, right? So I've been adjacent to IT for a long, long time. So like I can kind of squint and tilt my head and be like, oh, okay, yeah, like I kind of get it. But what that meant was when we started Expel, we rolled in and we like built the initial version of the product we built for ourselves. We were like, look, we've been practitioners, we know how this works. We're building a thing that's going to work for us. And it happened to work for a bunch of customers because we had done this work before. In Fixify, we weren't able to do that. So we had to come in with a lot more sort of ears wide open in a moment. I think that was a real advantage.
Yeah.
One of the things I would recommend, like this is a book that got recommended to me, and I would buy it again every day if I needed to. Right? Is this book called The Mom Test? It's got
Okay.
by a guy named Rob Fitzpatrick, and what it does is like I am very excited about technology, and I think my ideas are brilliant, and so my temptation when I go talk to customers about it is to tell them about my idea and be like, "This is what I'm building, isn't it cool?" And the lesson learned out of that book and the thing that we applied early days in Fixify is like, that is the wrong approach to that conversation if you really want to learn what the market needs. And so like Fitzpatrick goes through a really good, and it's like a super short book. It's just a really easy read. And I was sitting there reading and I'm flipping through. I'm like, oh my God, I have messed this up so many times in the past. Oh, wow. And then I was like, okay, we're just going to try it. We're going to run the conversation exactly like he says to do. And we learned so much out of that next conversation, because what you do is you don't say, this is my idea. You spend a lot of time going, what's your problem? Right. And the ability then to translate that into, okay, like, let me have 10 or 12 of those conversations, and now I really understand what's going on, is super duper useful.
Talk to me a little bit about some learnings around managing stakeholders, working with investors more generally, what they expect to hear versus what you maybe thought they wanted to hear, and just kind of work through some of the learnings in the past year and a half that you've had working with the investment side of the house.
One of the things that was super useful about the investors we were working with is we were able to say, like, they bring expertise that we do not have. And it's really important to understand, like, your investors are probably not product developers, right? They're probably not engineers. They probably don't have data science backgrounds. They might have been operators at one point, but like, honestly, I wouldn't leverage that too much in this early days context, right? But what they do know is they've seen about 50 million people start companies, right?
Yes.
They understand a lot about finances and like how burn rates work and how comparatives work and that sort of stuff. So early days, one of the things that we did, and like, this is how we did it at previous companies, and I think it's a really good process, is to sit down and it's going to be boring, but we made a budget. Right. And the reason is because what we don't want to be is one of those startups that figures out they're out of money when they're out of money. Right. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, we need to build a thing. Right. And we need to build it. It's got to be about this big. It's got about this much complexity to it. It's about this many people for about this long. So like, that's all. Those are numbers you can hide behind your thumb. There's a little bit of sort of operational rigor in doing it, but like, we don't have to shave a cat with a laser from space. We can do it at a certain granularity. Right. And so then what we did was we backed from there into like, what do the finances for this thing need to look like? There was a tremendous amount of back and forth with our investors about that kind of thing. We're like, okay, does this make sense? Like, given what you've seen in other companies, like, does that burn rate make sense? Do these costs make sense? Like, tell me about recruiters' fees, this sort of stuff. So we were able to really understand what was gonna happen with some of these things, because the thing that we could do is we could over rotate, be like, I know how to write software. Like, let's just go write some software. But in reality, the things that are going to kill me are the things I don't know. Right. And so then that's what I'm reaching out to my investors. The second thing that we did early days was we just made sure, like, hey, we're keeping the investors in the loop on what's going on. Right. So like, we're sending a newsletter. Like, we've got a thing that we send to the investors. We were sending a product update newsletter once a month, like clockwork, so that they would know. And then after a while, once we had enough like other things going on, it wasn't just building a product. We also send like an internal sort of like, this is the state of the business newsletter, and we send that once a month as well, because that enables the investors to sort of like be in touch, like they understand what's going on, right? And then the last thing that I do as a CEO is I have a one-on-one with each one of my investors once a month to make sure that like we have a chance to sort of kick things around and that sort of thing. But we also have a shared Slack channel with all of them in there, and we like ping them and we're like, hey, has anybody seen this? This kind of thing. And the thing that we do, or the thing that we try to leverage with our investors, is like, they may not particularly have expertise in a thing, but what they have is visibility into hundreds and hundreds of companies. So they themselves can look at something and go, well, that doesn't smell right, because I've never seen anybody do it that way before. So you can have that conversation, but they can also be like, I already know somebody who solved that problem. Right. And the thing about starting a company is like, most of the problems you're going to run into, like, someone else has solved it before. So like, unless you're really thinking you're going to discover fire, just go borrow somebody else's solution and try it. That's what we've experienced is a thing.
Often what I've found with folks that are seasoned executives and, have a lot of experience, they feel almost like they are supposed to know everything about how to start a company, and feel like they can't just raise their hand and be like, I actually don't know how to forecast the next 10 executive hires compensation, or I actually am not sure really where to start on equity bands, or whatever it might be.
I will say it is a bit, I'm not a person who loves admitting I don't know stuff. Like, it's just sort of a general weakness of mine. But I will tell you, one of the things that has been super helpful is just be able to show up and be like, okay, tell me how to think about this. And like, I've got, one of the investors I work with is great with like financial modeling and things. That I always call them up and be like, okay, tell me how I should think about this kind of thing, right? Like, how should I, and those are the kinds of things where like, I can read a bunch of blog posts and like, I'm sure I can find 27 listicles on Substack, which have like, these are the top 10 things to do with your financial model. Or I can talk to somebody who literally does this thing all day, every day. Right. So it's a thing. And so, yeah, it's been a path that's been super helpful for us.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about hiring. How did you approach building your founding team? And talk to me about some of the skill sets and qualities that you typically look for when you're vetting candidates.
I'll start with the last question and back into the first question. So the last question, like, how do we understand what roles we're going to need to hire? So that, again, in this boring sort of, green eye shade sort of accountant formula for me, starts actually with the budget. As we're thinking about the things that we need to accomplish, we're going to back into like what the teams look like and the headcount and stuff like this. Here's the thing that like I've watched people do a number of times as they've started companies, is like, no one thinks about the support roles that they're going to need to have. So like, I'm going to hire 22 engineers.
Sure.
Okay, are they going to have managers? Because if you're going to manage them all, you're going to have a hell of a time, right? So it's like, okay, so the average manager loading ratio, and this is again where you could go to your investors and be like, what do you think? Like, I haven't built teams before, so I'm like, okay, I know what the loading ratio would be. So we figure out like, okay, this is what the teams kind of roughly look like. This is what they're kind of shaped like. And this is sort of roughly the order we want to hire them in. So for Fixify, we had an operations team. We decided, hey, we want to build that out in Ireland for a series of reasons. And so we need to then also understand, okay, we're hiring another geo, so we have to have a whole bunch of things set up for that. So when we think about sourcing, one of the things I think about is if you're building a new team, and particularly if you're building a new remote team, you like the successful experience I've had is you build a senior first, right? So you go get like the more seasoned senior heads first, because what that'll do is that'll help you kind of put sort of the tent posts in the ground of like, hey, if I hire 12 junior engineers out of the gate, like my software is going to be super janky, and the first principal I hire is going to come in and be like, what have you been doing? Right?
There's a lot of tech.
Is you hire the principals first, right? So what we've done, we had pretty good networks. We've been, working for a long, long time. We had a number of people who wanted to come over with us, that sort of things. We were very blessed with a team sort of from jump. We ended up having about 9 or 10 people, like day 2 of the company. So that was actually really, really pretty cool. But then, when we built out Ireland, I ended up saying, okay, look, we're going to need to find somebody who's like a lead for this organization, sort of a site lead, first land, that kind of thing. Hired a recruiting firm that we used. Again, we went to our investors and we went to our network to say, okay, who's recruited in Ireland? What firms do they use? What are good, right? That kind of thing. So we did that. The other thing that we did was we made sure that people understood, like, there are some people in the company whose basically full-time job is going to be hiring, right? And that's not like you have HR people, but like if you're a leader at a startup, if you're a leader at an early stage startup, like just a huge chunk of your time is going to be building the team to start with. And those aren't ancillary duties, right? It's not like the thing you do in between. It's like, no, we got to focus on this sort of thing. We then did a lot of process around how we hire. So this is the other piece is like, so I'm competing with, amazing companies, right? So like when we first went to Ireland, we didn't even have a website, right? So we would reach out to people and be like, we're a company you've never heard of before. We swear to God, we're not like the mafia or anything. Like this is not some scam. Would you like to come work for us, right? And so part of doing that well is we had to have a process that was pretty buttoned up. We have a way that we approach this. We write job descriptions in a very particular way. We write job ads in a particular way. We do interviews in a very particular way. We made sure that people had a good candidate experience. So at the end, they were like, those people are legit. I'm totally doing this, that kind of thing. So that was another piece that we had to kind of build out, and then understand that we weren't going to hire everybody all at once. And so as we were doing it, we've got to make sure that like we've hired the person, now we can ramp them. So we actually have a plan. We did this with every new hire has like a Notion doc and they walk in, we use Notion internally, like they walk in, document. It's like, hi, welcome. We're super jazzed you're here. Like, here is the first day. We've set up meetings for you to meet people that you need to talk to on your teams. Here are the things in the first 90 days we think you want to get done. Here are some to-do lists. That's so they, you're not walking your first day and going like, I guess I worked.
Am I productive? Well, I think that's so important because that can be why a lot of folks feel maybe unstable in an early stage company or unsure if they're making good progress. And so I think it's so important that leadership and the founding team is so clear in the early days on not only exactly what they need, what they're hiring for, but also what hitting it out of the park looks like.
I had a manager years ago tell me, like, there's no one out there who's trying to do a bad job. Nobody. Like they're literally
Yes.
nobody. Like, no one goes to work going, I'm really going to screw it up today, right? And particularly if you go to work at a startup, you're talking about people who are like, I want to make an impact. Like the number one reason people go to work at a startup is like, I want to see the impact of my work. I want to work in a
Yeah.
small environment so I can really have an impact. And
Hmm.
so setting people up and being like, okay, these are the things you need to do so that because you've all worked at those companies where you hire 5 people and they're combat ineffective for 9 months because they're just wandering around trying to find like the break room, kind of thing. So if we short circuit that, it helps tremendously. And then the other thing we discovered this actually a couple jobs ago is if you set it up so somebody gets a quick win like the first day. So
Mm,
actually at Expel for a long time we had an engineering team like someone's checking in production code their first day. It's going to be something dumb, but like they're doing it right. And it was like that class
I
of thing
love
where
that.
they go like, okay, I had a win. I'm part of this team.
I got a point on the board. I don't have a target on my back. I'm good for a second.
And then the second thing is like, and we actually got this from, I got this from another leader, and it was super interesting advice, which was he actually sits down with new hires and says, "Hey, let me tell you that there's going to be feedback in this process. There's going to be times that things go wrong, and I'm going to show up and be like, hey, this isn't going well, something like this. Okay. That doesn't mean like your job's in jeopardy. Let me tell you exactly what it's going to sound like if your job's in jeopardy, right? Let me tell you exactly what that moment will be
Hmm.
like, and it will come looking like this. And if it doesn't look like this, then that's not what's going on, right? So you can
Then
calm
you're
down.
okay.
Yeah. And it was like, huh. So we've done sort of variations of that, and I think for new hires, it's helped a bunch to be like, oh, okay, this is what good sounds like, this is what not so good sounds like. It's not like we're not in, to your point, I don't have a target on my back kind of a thing because you're entering a high chaos environment. So a little bit of stability is usually pretty welcome. The last thing that we've done, and I did this with when I hired my sales lead, I've done this for several new hires that I've hired specifically, is like every day for the first 2 weeks at 5 o'clock, I'll see you on a Zoom for a couple minutes. I don't have an
I
agenda.
love
Like
that.
I'm not going to grill you about stuff you've learned. I'm just like, got any questions for me? Like, how's it going? Like, what'd you do today? Oh, cool. Yeah. How'd that meeting go?
Talk to me about how you track success in the early days and how you quantify whether a day in the office was a productive one.
I think to start with, in terms of how we think about targets and goals and things like this. So I'll tell you, like, I have a sort of a mental model in my head that's sort of like, if you ever seen one of those maps where they have like multiple layers on the map. So if you do like hiking or whatever, all trails has one.
Yes.
Like, okay, let's
Hmm.
look at the topography, and then let's look at like the rainfall, and let's look at the temperature and that sort of stuff. So like I
Yeah.
think about the plan that way, right? So there is a plan that is the financial plan. This is the when we need to raise money. This is when we're going to be out of money. This sort of stuff based on our budget. There is then a product plan that should be somehow in service to some of these financial goals. There is a hiring plan, this sort of thing. So you can think about those as different layers on the same map. So if we
Yeah.
think about it that way, one of the things that we do early days, right, is we're going to sit down and say, hey, look, the point of this thing. So for Fixify, we're like, look, we want to build a help desk that leaves end users feeling a particular way. So
Mhm.
that's going to mean we need a platform and we need a team to run the platform. We're going to need to sell this thing. We think we're going to go to customers about this big. All of these sort of like thumbnail assumptions turn into a financial plan. And then we go out and say, okay, we're going to need a certain amount of money to get us to our next goal, right? And so our next goal is going to need to look about like this. Like, what are we going to need to show up with to say, and I can either raise my next round or I can go cash flow positive, whatever, that kind of thing. And so that's my first milestone, is like those kinds of high level metrics. And I'm going to work backward in like, okay, how many customers do I need for that? Cool. Like, how many people would I need to hire for that? All of that sort of stuff. And then from there, thinking about the product goals that will undergird that and say, okay, so in order to support the 10 customers I need or the 50 customers I need, whatever it is in your thing, in our case, it was like, hey, I need 10 customers. I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, fair enough. I need the following features. And since we're going to be signing them on here, hey, we at least better be able to onboard them. And this is where it gets kind of scary for people. If you're used to like, I've got a product already, is like, sometimes you're like, we're going to build the onboarding feature because that's the thing we need right now. Like, and I need it right now.
And then sometimes you're selling futures and
Exactly right.
you're just
No, one of the things I would say is if you're like, we were blessed and we continue to be blessed with early customers who were like, I understand that I'm buying a thing that is still being built. right? And I am signing on to help you build it. And that has been some of the most amazing relationships, because these, like, we were very transparent with people about what are we working on, what are we doing, that sort of stuff. And they get to do product feedback and that sort of stuff. So they know that
Yeah.
the track's being laid down a little bit ahead of the thing. In terms of getting everyone organized around those goals, because now I've got this sort of like, I've got these financial targets, I've got sort of like what we're trying to do there. I have sales targets, I have product milestones, I have internal company milestones. And it's really easy for that to just turn into like white noise in the background
Yeah.
of I got to slang some code or whatever. So what we do is we actually use a framework that we borrowed from our last job. It's called strategy on a page. So basically what we do is we have a single page, like our entire strategy can fit on one page. And
Okay.
there's 3 columns, and sort of like there's an overarching priority. Like, this is the one thing everyone should leave. If we were talking about this, it's the one thing everyone should just have off the top of their head. And then there's 3 goals. And the goals very simply are get customers, keep customers, build a company that doesn't suck. All right, well, I need to build a marketing program that generates this number of leads. I need to, have this number of programs. I need to have, a PMM function that does X, Y, and Z, all of that sort of stuff. So that's what goes in there. Keep customers. I need to have these people on board. I need to do a certain amount of work for them. I need to have a customer success function doing X, Y, and Z. So that's what goes in there. And then build a customer company that doesn't suck is like, hey, we need to have a recruiting and training program. We need to have these new hire documents wired up. We need to have people combat effective within 30 days, that kind of thing. And so that sort of, we then get the whole company together every 6 months. And sometimes, like, we do it, every 3 months we sort of check in on it. But every 6 months we go, okay, this is the new objective, like the new high level objective. It only goes out 6 months, right? And these are the things we're going to do to get there. Everybody got it? Right. And then, break. So that's how we kind of do strategy like that.
Strategy on a page is one that I haven't heard, but I think it's a great way to think about it. And it's a way to simplify all of the chaos that's happening around you and just try and make it as concise and effective as possible for the group, which I think is great.
So one of the things that we've got to do is I'm hiring a team of people. So, like, at Fixify right now, we have a team of about 35, 36 people. And every one of them needs to be combat effective. Every one of them needs to be pulling on the oars. And they cannot check in with me or with my co-founders or with their boss every day. They just have to have a sense of what we're working towards. So one of the things that I found is useful is to, when we're talking about these goals, is to sit down and talk to people about, let me tell you what it's going to feel like to work here in 6 months. Okay. We're going to have about this many employees, which means we're adding new team members about every week, right? We are going to have the following number of projects ongoing. We're going to have this number of customers, which mean we'll be adding new customers about this often, that sort of stuff. And if you pick the right details, what it enables is like, oh, okay, we're adding 2 customers a month or whatever it is, 2 customers a week. Customer success is like, my current process isn't going to scale. Huh. All right, I didn't have to tell them that. They thought about it. We're like, yeah, we're never gonna make it. We better work on that. So it helps. Like, I can be very high level at the top level. So what we actually do when we do the SOAP is we actually do there is a narrative section, which is like, let me tell you how it's going to feel, right?
Yeah.
And there's a like, here's your strategy on a page, which is just some very, very high level, like, these must be truths. And then, hey, everybody, your job is to help us, make this happen. You now have enough context to be like, I know from the SOAP that you guys are looking for this, and that isn't going to get it there.
This is how you react to how it's going to feel.
Exactly. And if we've been blessed, right? If we've hired well, our folks will show up and they'll be like, hey, so I notice in the SOAP it says this. I'm just telling you right now, you guys have totally missed this thing over here, which is going to be impacting. And like, oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Like, that's incredible, right? So like, we get everybody's turning, everybody's brains are going, and like, now we're all sort of solving a problem together because we know where we want to end up.
Reflecting on your journey, I think I would love to hear one thing that someone has told you, maybe before you started as a CEO, that you've carried with you and that has helped you as a leader.
Okay, so I will tell you the thing that I heard, and I heard it in 2 different forms, but they rhymed enough that I have stitched them together in my head, and I think about it pretty much daily, is that I ask a lot of people when I was first thinking about this and first thinking about becoming a CEO. I would go to founding CEOs and be like, okay, what shocked you about being a CEO, and what shocked you about being a founder, right? And one person told me this thing, which, like, basically, as a founder, every day is going to either be your best day or your worst day. There's just not a hell of a lot of in between days. There's not a lot of days where you're like, well, meh, right? Like, and there's so many existential moments. There's so many times where like the road ahead is unclear and this is incredibly stressful. And oh my God, why did I leave my safe job? And like this, like that kind of thing. And there's so many days where you're like, you have that good customer call and you're like, we are on the right track. We are gonna kill it,
Yeah.
And so there's a whipsaw that I found us go through, and I've seen myself do this. And so one of the things that I've ended up doing is by knowing every day is going to be the best day and the worst day, I end up in this moment where I'm just like, hey, like, yes, the customer call went amazing. I'm going to tamp that down. Like, enthusiasm is good. I'm just going to tamp it down a little bit because we're going to lose focus. And if it went real bad, because every now and then you get on one of those customer calls, you're like, well, that guy didn't want what we were selling and he was real mean about it, that kind of thing. So when you have one of those, it's like, man, this sucks.
It just kind of levels everything out.
You just kind of bring it in as a thing. Yeah. So one of the things that I asked the CEO I used to work for, I was like, okay, so I'm going to go be a CEO. What advice would you give me? And he said a very, very similar thing. He's like, figure out a way to get the leveling internally. Right? Because people aren't going to show up as a founder and a CEO. People aren't going to show up and go, you're doing a great job. They're just not. Like, that's just not a thing. So you've got to figure out a way for yourself to be like, I feel good and I feel satisfied and I feel like I've done the necessary, which is one of the reasons why I think like so many people in Silicon Valley like have an exercise regimen and they do a whole bunch of other sorts of things, is to try to do this. Like there's a regulation thing.
Creating structure.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm a technical person. And like, I was blown away about how many people, when I was like, okay, what's tough or what was surprising, almost universally, they're like, let me tell you about the emotional angles of this job.
Yeah, no, that is quite literally why I called this founder therapy series, because there's just so much that goes into it. And yes, there's going to be so many great days and so many incredible highs and moments where you feel like you've just got it in the bag. And then it's a long journey. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. What does great look like at the end of the day? How do I feel like I'm doing the best work I possibly can? Everyone just wants to feel impactful, right?
As a person who I have kids and I coach a kid's sport and this sort of stuff, I end up finding myself telling people pretty often, like, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. It's really easy to go on any podcast, blog site, anything like this, and just read about like the amazing stuff they're up to at startup X, Y, and Z. And like if you hear someone interviewed, they're like, oh well, it's been an unbroken chain of successes, starting with the moment that I unlocked my inner genius or whatever. And I listen to that and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess, because it doesn't feel like that to me, right? And then I'm like, oh yeah, but that's sort of the survivorship bias, and that's the story they're telling, and that's cool. Yeah. But like, then I realized that's their outside, right? Like inside, every one of these companies has like, we screwed up these 3 things, but this and this and this, that kind of stuff. And so just knowing that everyone is on that journey and everyone is kind of riding that is super helpful for me, right?
Cool. All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for joining me. You are awesome. I always love any excuse to be able to hang out with you. So thank you so much for hopping on and sharing some wisdom with our listeners. I so appreciate you, Matt.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great time.
Awesome. And thank you all for listening to Never Too Early. More to come soon.